Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. We are almost through with chapter 22, so this might be a shorter episode. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you to please share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm going to also encourage you to listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if you have not yet, and to listen to future episodes if by the time you get a hold of this, there are future episodes out. We are just about finished with this book, Evicted. We got about 2 chapters left, and then I think the epilogue is after that. This has been a very enlightening book. I've learned a lot, not just about the unique experiences from these different individual perspectives when it comes to the issues of housing, but also some of the overall issues of housing that affect everybody generally. And I've learned a lot about a lot about the landlord's relationship with the city. I've learned about how the sheriff's relationship with the landlords and with tenants. Learned about some of the role the government plays with housing vouchers and things of that nature in Section 8. Learned a lot about the history of housing. And so it's been a very informative book. Again, this book goes very well with The Color of Law, High Risers, and Citizens, Cops, and Power. And I think one of the things that I'm very, very much consciously trying to do is read different books and then group them together as for issues that they address, and be able to point out how each different piece of literature addresses some of those issues in its own unique way. So let's dive back into Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Okay. After getting into several conflicts with congregants, bishops, and eventually her minister, Crystal left Mount Calvary and joined Restoration International Ministries, an inner-city church in a bland 2-story office building on 41st and Burley. One Sunday, Crystal sat in the third pew from the front and began clapping with the music. She wore a black shirt and green pants, unbuttoned and unzipped halfway to fit. The pastor, a black woman with hair falling in arching waves down to her shoulders, wore a white robe with gold accents. She paced with the Queen's authority, stopping as the Spirit led her. Quote, "God says he is the truth and the light," end quote, she said. The young man at the piano fluttered his hands, and even the younger fellow behind the drums began teasing a cymbal. Quote, "The truth and the light. You hearing me?" End quote. Quote, "Amen," end quote, Crystal said. After being kicked out of her apartment with Vanetta, Crystal was admitted to a homeless shelter. Then, through a weary, looping rhythm, make a friend, use a friend, lose a friend, Crystal found, for short bursts, dry and warm places to sleep. When those bridges burned, she dropped back into street homelessness, returning to St. Joseph's or the Amtrak station. Sometimes she would walk the streets all night and sleep on the bus once morning broke. But through it all, she almost never missed church. Quote, "Sha-la-la-la-la, yaba shota, not tamamama," end quote, the pastor prayed into a microphone. The language of tongues was spoken in a cadence the shape of a heartbeat. A small entrance, followed by a spike, then a quivering trailing off. Quote, "Are you in the press? Are you squeezing yourself up into the crowd to see Jesus? Whoa," end quote. She stumbled back as if bumped by an invisible force. Quote, "All right, Pastor," end quote, Crystal hollered. Crystal had always believed that SSI was a more secure income source than a paycheck. You couldn't get fired from SSI. Your hours couldn't get cut. Quote, "SSI always come," end quote, she said, until one day it didn't. She had been approved for SSI as a minor, but her adult reevaluation found her ineligible. Now Crystal's only source of income came from food stamps. She tried donating plasma, but her veins were too small. She asked her spiritual, foster, and even biological mothers for money, but what they could give her didn't go very far. She didn't ask anything from her church because, quote, "it always led to conflict," end quote. Because she didn't know what else to do, Crystal went, quote, on the stroll, end quote, and began selling sex. She had never been a morning person, but soon learned that it was the best time to turn tricks, catching men on their way to work. Quote, is mama okay? End quote, the pastor asked. She was looking at an older woman being held up by two people. Quote, no, end quote. Quote, then we're going to stop everything and pray for her, end quote. The pastor knelt down in front of the woman. A dozen or so churchgoers surrounded her, some standing on chairs, some with their hands on the old woman's head. Quote, reach out your hands this way and pray, end quote, the pastor commanded. And her congregation obeyed, even the children. Quote, oh, Jesus, end quote, the pastor yelled into the microphone. Quote, oh, by the blood, oh, you deaf spirit, you stroke spirit, come out, end quote. Crystal was bouncing and moving her hands from shoulders to hips, chanting, quote, by your stripes, Lord, by your stripes, end quote. Quote, by the blood, end quote, prayed the pastor. Quote, the blood, Shabbat I bind you. Come back, mama, come back, end quote. The music simmered low, waiting. The clutch of people surrounding the older woman parted, revealing her limp and blood-drained face. She looked to be asleep or dead. Then the huddle closed in again. After a few minutes, the people encircling the woman grew louder and stepped outward to show the pastor kissing the woman about her face and hands. People began clapping as the woman rose to her feet. Quote, praise God, end quote, the pastor said. She let out a triumphant scream into the microphone and collapsed to her knees, praying. The piano and drums kicked up and the church exploded. People began running up and down the aisle, shouting and singing. Someone found a tambourine and started pounding it. The drummer crashed the cymbals and the pianist lingered on the high notes. A woman yelled and sprinted in place, sweat streaming down her face. Quote, we ain't trying to have no funeral up in here, end quote, the pastor boasted. And there was Crystal, hands raised, fingers spread, beaming and dancing. Quote, God got me, end quote, she cried. Quote, God got me, end quote. And that brings us to the end of chapter 22 and to the beginning of chapter 23. And here, let's have a small reflection. So we see how Crystal's level of desperation has led her into sex work. And one of the first things that I thought about when reading that is the chapter in The End of Policing that was about policing sex work, and how within that chapter it talked about the multitude of reasons that predominantly or disproportionately women of color and members of the LGBTQIA plus community turn to sex work as a means of being able to make money and to have financial income. And so that's one of the first things that I thought about. And then also I thought about all the different things that have happened leading up into Crystal's life to get her to the point of feeling as if sex work was the only option or the best option that was for her. And again, I don't think that I want to make sure that I'm coming across properly. I'm not, I have not judgmental or condemning or looking down upon Crystal for engaging in sex work. I think just the opposite happens when you read through this book and you see these experiences that she's had and you understand the trauma she's had in the past and the life that she's had. You begin to empathize and to understand with her. And I think that that's one of the things that the criminal justice system and prison and mass incarceration also doesn't take into account is that these are human beings that have had certain circumstances, certain environments, certain experiences that have led them to making some of these decisions. And when you try to isolate just that decision or just that action from all the things that preceded, you take away what makes us human. You take away our humanity. You take away the complexity that we all have as individuals. And the truth is, none of us are as good as the best action that we've taken, and none of us are as bad as the worst action that we've taken. We are all an amalgamation of all of our actions. And so we have seen how the amalgamation of experiences that Crystal has had has led her to the action of sex work. And one of the biggest issues she's had is trying to keep a roof over her head, trying to keep a house over her head, and or a roof over her head, trying to keep a house and or a place to live, I should say. And so that is, I think, what really stands out to me. And that's one of the things that I've learned throughout my journey in these last 2 years is the importance of seeing the full story, of not just hearing about the one action that somebody may have taken that may be despicable and grotesque, but taking the time to see their full story, to see them as a complete human being, to know about the things that contributed to them being in the mind state to make the decisions that they made. And so here, this is short. This would be a short episode. Let's see if we can, maybe we knock out a page or two of this next chapter and then end the episode. And then that way we can finish the next chapter all in the following episode. Okay, chapter 23, The Serenity Club. Scott had been 8 days sober when he went to the Serenity Club, a smoke-filled, woody-paneled AA bar that served stale coffee and root beer floats. I should have said AA bar, excuse me, AA bar, Alcoholic Anonymous. Quote, they're addictive, end quote, one regular with the rap sheet said about the floats. Quote, but I don't do robberies for them, end quote. When it was time for the speakers, a light-skinned Puerto Rican woman in a black bandana and vinyl jacket took the podium. This was Anna Aldia, an acid-dropping, coke-snorting, cowhide tough biker lady turned high priestess of AA. A few months shy of her 10-year chip, Anna had helped dozens of addicts through the program. During her speech, she pointed to her newest project. Quote, I love you, Scott, end quote, she said. Quote, keep coming back. It works, end quote. Quote, if you work it, end quote, the room finished. A week prior, Scott had woken up from his 3-day bender, broke and hungover. To still his nerves, he dressed and left his apartment. It was early Saturday morning, and Scott walked as the city slept. He made it all the way to Pito's house and got him out of bed. 2 years sober himself, Pito knew what to do with the detoxing junkie who wanted to get clean. Plenty of water, coffee, vitamins, cigarettes, food, and, above all, constant monitoring. Pito stayed with Scott all the day, and that evening, he took him to meet his brother, David, 14 years sober, and his wife, Anna. Anna lit a fire in their backyard pit and sat up with Scott until the bars closed at 2 a.m. It was a nauseating, painful, stretched-out day, Scott's first drug-free in years. Day 5 was miserable in a different way. Scott passed it sobbing at Pito's house. Quote, I can feel my body getting better, end quote, he said. Quote, but when you have years and years and years of not feeling anything from drinking and dope, then it kind of hits you, end quote. AA had its own binge for people starting to get sober. 90 meetings in 90 days. The idea was to surround the baby, their slang for newcomer, with a support structure that would replace his junkie network, and to never leave him alone. So Scott began showing up at Pito's before the liquor stores opened at 8 a.m. and ending his days around Anna's fire pit after last call. Scott was almost 3 weeks sober when his landlord told him to go to DP's newly acquired pit bull. Scott was almost 3 weeks sober when his landlord told him to go. DP's newly acquired pit bull had got out and somehow snuck into the downstairs neighbor's apartment. The neighbors called the police, who called the landlord, who, wanting to keep his long-term tenants, gave Scott and DP the boot. They told him he might as well sleep there too. By that time, Scott was basically living at David and Anna's. They told him he might as well sleep there too. David and Anna's working-class home was one of those places that seemed to belong to everybody. People would walk through the door without knocking and open the refrigerator without asking. Quote, this is the Aldia recovery house, end quote, Anna would say. Quote, if somebody's not here, somebody's calling, end quote. She kept large bowls of rice and beans on hand and never locked the door. Scott began sleeping on the Diaz's couch and picking up their children from school. Soon, he began working with David, a freelance mason, and, in lean weeks, a metal scrapper. Scott liked the work, especially the urban adventure of hunting for aluminum or steel scraps, even if it did involve the occasional dumpster dive. A barrel-chested Puerto Rican man with pinched eyes and a ready grin, sometimes David paid Scott, and sometimes he didn't. Scott didn't complain. How could he, after what David and Anna had done for him? So, hearing about this house that Anna Aldia has is something that it makes me think of. It makes me think of concepts that I've learned more about, co-op houses and things like that since I've been involved in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice these last 2 years. And to me, the first time that I heard about it, it was something that just felt very empowering. It's something that, with something like this, with AA, where you're helping people who are dealing with addiction, it goes to show you that we exist collectively. A lot of times we can experience things individually, and that can get us into this place of feeling alone, of feeling like we have to combat these things alone. And the truth of the matter is, we are coming so far down the line in civilization and in history that everything that we experience is a residual effect of collective decisions, of collective thought, of collective actions. And the only way that we can adequately struggle against some of the negative aspects of negative struggle against some of the negative impacts of negative collectivism is through positive collectivism, is through community, is through finding your community. Which I think is one of the things that I learned from reading the book Citizens, Cops, and Power, is the subtle difference between the concept of community and the concept of neighborhood, or the concept of community and the concept of locale. And so we see here that Scott has found a community. He had one community when he was doing drugs and he was addicted, and there's another community that he is now located as he's trying to struggle against this addiction and struggle away from alcoholism and drugs. And so, again, I personally have never had to combat drug abuse or drug addiction. I have combated very small amounts of alcoholism. I don't even know if alcoholism be the right term, but I was much more of an avid drinker and drank more regularly when I was younger. And even up until my involvement with police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for me to have a couple of drinks every day or have a drink on a daily basis. And in the midst of being part of this struggle, that was a habit that I just broke off. And again, it wasn't something that was as extreme as other people, but it was a seed that was there that at times it would grow and it would be a bigger issue, and then at times it wouldn't be as much of an issue. But it was something that I adopted through as a coping mechanism at a very young age. This society throws alcohol in your face on a regular basis. And it doesn't throw alcohol in your face on a regular basis because of how much fun it is to drink or because of how good you feel when you drink. It throws it in your face because of capitalism. There are people who make money off of people drinking, that people make money off of people drinking and driving, people who make money off of people getting arrested for drinking and driving, people who make money off of all sorts of addiction. That is one of the pitfalls of capitalism, is that people try to find ways to make money off of every single thing that they can, which leads to a further exploitation of people. And so for me, what stands out is the collectivism that's at play and the community that's at play, and understanding how when you're advocating against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, it's important to understand that some people, when trying to cope with the effects of police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, use alcohol and use drugs. And so it's important to have some type of understanding, some type of empathy, some type of information about what it is like to combat that drug use, to combat that symptom. So we're going to end this episode right here, and then we'll be back to yeah. Let's try to knock out one more. Let's knock out one more page, and then we'll end the episode. That'll get us to about 30 minutes. At first, Scott liked cleaning the Serenity Club. The pay was piddly, $7.15 an hour, which would give him around $100 a week. But because he worked alone from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. most nights, it gave him time to think. He thought about finding someone, although he didn't know where to start if not in a gay bar. Craigslist? He thought about his sister's wedding. Maybe he could make a home for that. He prayed, quote, "Please don't let me use tomorrow," end quote. But most of all, he would dream about returning to nursing. He thought that would be a, quote, "great way to stay sober because you start thinking about other people and not your poor, pathetic shit," end quote. But the road ahead felt daunting. The nursing board didn't just take Scott's license away. Understandably, it made it extremely difficult for him to earn it back. He would have to submit to, quote, "the testing of urine specimens at a frequency of not less than 56 times per year," end quote, which would cost thousands of dollars. He'd have to stay clean for 5 years and attend bi-weekly AA meetings. Scott recognized his weaknesses. He didn't know if he would have tried harder to get clean years ago if the nursing board had not put license reinstatements so far out of reach. But giving up did come easier when things seemed impossible. The, quote, "impaired professionals," end quote, gathering had left him discouraged too. One nurse said it had taken her over a year to find a job after being sober for about 2 years and passing all the requirements, and she had a master's degree. There were stations between having a revoked nursing license and having one with full privileges. But to get a nursing job with a restricted license, one that didn't allow you to handle narcotics, say, was rare. Scott knew people. Over the years, he had stayed in touch with several nursing pals, and some had moved into positions of influence. He even had an aunt who was the dean of nursing at a large state university nearby. But staying in touch with these people had meant hiding his addiction and poverty, so approaching them for help was complicated. The last time Scott spoke with a friend who was the director of a local nursing home, he said he was doing fine. Quote, "So now I'd have to go back and say, oh no, I really wasn't doing well. I was still a junkie. I lied to you," end quote. Scott didn't feel he could call in any favors. After 4 months of cleaning the club with only one night off in total, Scott began to grow weary. He was sober and bored. He would empty the ashtrays, scrub the toilets, and, at the end of the night, grade his performance. A-, C+. Then 21 hours later, he would do it all again. At least when he was a junkie, his life had purpose. Get dope. Now he felt as though he were pacing in a small, dull loop. Anna had asked Scott to pay $200 a month to sleep on the couch and to put his food stamps toward groceries, which made it difficult for him to save much. It was more than just his work at the club. As the initial high of sobriety wore off, Scott began to sour on AA in general. This post-honeymoon sensation was so common that AA had a phrase for it. Quote, "falling off your pink cloud," end quote. Quote, "ambivalence has turned into animosity," end quote, Scott said. It embarrassed him, spending nights in folding chairs, semicircles with washed-up drunks and cokeheads, drinking Folgers out of styrofoam cups and swapping horror stories. Scott grew to hate the rituals, the stranger's hand on his shoulder, the hoary sayings, quote, "but by the grace of God," end quote, and, quote, "let go and let God," end quote. Not to mention the Serenity Club's crowd's belief that fighting addiction with the prescription, methadone say, was cheating. Scott was considering going to the county clinic to get something to help with the cravings and depression, but he couldn't tell Anna or David. Scott had puked and shivered and wept to push the poison out of his system, only to look around and see that he was still broke and homeless, logging stupid hours at AA and dipping a mop into a bucket at midnight. Quote, "fucking addicts and drunks," end quote, he would yell into an empty room whose folding chairs had not been put back. Quote, "this makes me crazy," end quote. Okay, and then we're going to end this episode there, and then we'll be back tomorrow to continue reading Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. And again, just empathizing with situations, empathizing with experiences that are foreign to me is what really stands out to me from that last passage we just read. So remember, we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I will holler at you tomorrow.